good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wayne Motts, and it's my honor to be the Chief Executive Officer here at the National Civil War Museum. We want to welcome all of you to Dauphin County Free Day, and we want to say, in case you didn't know, you are in Dauphin County. I think most of you all know that, and we really want to give a great shout out to our Dauphin County Commissioners, Commissioner Hayes, Commissioner Priest, Commissioner Hardwick, all three of our commissioners, huge supporters here of the National Civil War Museum. So on behalf of the National Civil War Museum Board and staff, all its volunteers, we want to thank for the years of support that we've gotten from our county commissioners and for the support for Free Day here today. And we're so honored to have Michael with us today as our speaker. This is the third time Michael has been to the National Civil War Museum, by my recollection. I'm hoping I'm remembering that correctly. Every time, it's just been wonderful. He's just such a dynamic speaker. And the first thing is, when he walks out the door, everybody says, when are you going to have Michael come back to the National Civil War Museum? So we're so honored to have him. Let me tell you a little bit about Michael B. Moore. He was the founding president and CEO of the International African American Museum in South Carolina. That's located where almost half of all enslaved African Americans took their first step in America. That's in Charleston, South Carolina. The $125 million museum will give voice to the people who arrived there, to their struggle and to their pain, and to the perseverance and contributions all in the making of America. And a little bit about Michael. He's a seasoned business community leader, board member, and author. He's experienced leading both iconic global brands and smaller brands, more entrepreneurial companies. Michael is a thought leader on brand strategy, consumer behavior, and social justice, and as well as African American history. He has 2 degrees from Syracuse and Duke University. He is a father of 4 sons, which means he has no extra time, except for coming to see us today. Thank you, Michael. And he lives in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. You probably know that Michael is related to former United States Congressman, former enslaved African American named Robert Smalls, very famous African American in the history of this country. And his talk today is the farther you can look back, the farther ahead you can see, or why history matters. And anytime somebody talks about why history matters at the National Civil War Museum, it is a great day. Thank you, and welcome Michael Moore, please.
Well, hello, everybody. Hello. It's a beautiful, although somewhat chilly day. I live, as mentioned, in Charleston. Hello. And, it was starting to feel a little brisk in Charleston, but in Charleston, that means it's 55. So a little bit of a different weather temperature out here for me this morning. But it's always great to be here. As mentioned, I've been here a few times, always been warmly received and had a lot of fun, and really have a lot of respect for the work that Wayne and the folks here, the board members, the staff do. This is a wonderful museum. And in many ways, now that I have been living in this museum space the last 4 or 5 years, I'm jealous. We don't have this kind of space, for example, so it's great to be here. What I thought I'd do today is, I can't come to a Civil War museum and not sort of dive in a little bit to the Robert Smalls story. Many of you may know the story, but some of you may not. And so I want to just talk about that, but within the context of, ultimately, of how that impacted me growing up. I grew up, in a tough time in the 60s and 70s in Boston, where, issues around race were kind of testy, let's just put it nicely. And so I just want to talk about that, and then just how being connected to this legacy, just what it has meant, and how it has influenced my thinking about history. And then I'd love to talk to you a little bit about the museum that we've been building, and then I'd love to engage in a conversation if you have any questions or anything else. We'd love to do that. So Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls was born in a little shack behind the big house. His mother was a domestic, and so her quarters were right behind the big house. And it's interestingly, it's said that Robert was born during the time when an enslaved person was being hung. He had ostensibly created or did something wrong and was being hung, and it was the big entertainment that day, and so everybody in town was at the Armory. This was in Beaufort, South Carolina. He was born 1839, and so this was, I guess, April 1839. And his mother, Lydia, was 45, I think, at the time. And as I got older, and I've been hearing this story forever, but as I got older and I started having kids, and I started having kids a little bit later. My first child, I think, was born when I was 35. And I noticed how in the hospitals, if you're a mother and you're in your mid-30s or older, I mean, it's kind of a big deal. It's considered a high-risk pregnancy, and there's all these procedures that you have to go through. Well, back in the 1830s, enslaved woman in her mid-40s who delivers her son on the floor of her shack alone. I could just only imagine just what she must have felt and have gone through. But I think in some small way that is part of the sort of frame that Robert Smalls kind of grew up in. I've thought often, and I'll talk about what he did, but I thought, well, how was he able to do this? Every enslaved person ostensibly would want to, if they had an opportunity to be free, to seize their freedom, they would take advantage of that. So what is it about Robert that allowed him to do that? And in part, in large part, I think it was the influence that he had. He had an opportunity to live with his mother. So most enslaved people, youngsters, children, at the point in time which they could be monetized, that they could work, they were taken from their mother and segregated and sent out to work. So the fact that Robert had an opportunity to live, to grow up with his mother, and the fact that she apparently was, of some real stuff. She had some real strength to her and fed him both physically, but more importantly, I think mentally, spiritually, gave him a sense of who he, not just who society thought he was, but who he could be. It's said in our family, it is popular now to use the word enslaved as opposed to calling someone a slave. And, I've been hearing about that terminology forever. It's said that Lydia, Robert's mother, said to him, "You are not a slave. You are enslaved. This may be the condition that you're in, but this isn't who you are as a human being." And I think that's the distinction that people are trying to make now. And I think that's that little extra, stuff that Robert had inside him. So he grew up behind the big house, but he grew up with the children and grandchildren of the master. And he grew up in an advantaged position relative to other enslaved people. He wasn't on the plantation, and so there are a number of advantages. And one of those advantages was in terms of his socialization. Like I said, he grew up with these children, and so, in the South, in the Low Country, in Beaufort, right on the water there is a cultural tradition that lives to this day called Gullah Geechee. I am a son of Gullah Geechee people, and it's a separate culture and language, foodways, spiritual sort of traditions, and it grew up because all these Africans came over, many of them not from the same language tradition. People were coming from all over Africa, coming here, and so they had to pick up some English, but they also, part of what made this Gullah Geechee culture stick was because they were separated from the mainland. There were a lot of these sea islands where they grew rice, they grew, eventually indigo and other kinds of things. And so there wasn't a lot of interaction between folks on these sea islands and the mainland. So this culture, this creolization, was able to stick. And again, to this day, you can go down and talk to somebody, and there are a lot of little different dialects, but you can talk to someone who is Gullah Geechee, and you won't, unless you've ever heard it and sort of grew up with it, you won't understand a word. Sometimes you can pick up some things here or there, but so I say all that to say, I'm sort of wrapping around and telling you lots of context. But so Robert grew up, his native sort of tongue was this Gullah Geechee language, this creolization, this part English, part, these African languages that the folks sort of created. But he also, because he was with the children of the master, he learned English, the Queen's English, or however you would take it. So for him, that would be a skill that would put him in very good stead as he got older, because he was, in essence, he was bilingual. And throughout most of his life, he navigated both of those worlds, and those early experiences, I think, really helped to prepare him for that. So Robert grew up, and I'm fast forwarding now, and he was playing, would play with these children, grandchildren of the master. A certain time in the evening, bell would ring or whistle would blow, curfew. Enslaved people had to come in. If you weren't enslaved, you ignored it. And so Robert's playing with these kids, and the whistle would go, and he would always, sort of bristle at, why do I have to do that? And he just, he sort of rebelled at how society, the box that society was putting him in. And that manifested in a number of different ways throughout his life. As the story goes, he was getting in trouble. He was doing little things, not serious trouble, but just getting in trouble. And one time his mother actually, because she knew that he was growing up in a isolated bubble of slavery, let's say, she took him both to the plantation to give him a sense of that life there, but she also took him to this armory where I mentioned that enslaved person was hung, to view another enslaved person being disciplined, being whipped, to give him a sense of the reality of the world. Again, fast forward a little bit, when he's 12, these issues were continuing, and his mother decided, in conversation with their master, that it was time for him to go, and actually sent him to Charleston. Now, Beaufort, by driving in today's standards, is an hour and a half, 2 hours south of Charleston. And so, at that time, there were no real roads, and so it was a boat ride, and it was, it's probably a day, boat ride. But it was the big city. Charleston, was, many people don't know this. I didn't know this until I got to Charleston. Charleston was the richest city in America in colonial times for over 100 years. So for 100 years, we're not that old of a nation, but for a century, largely because of the profitability of the slave trade itself, Charleston was the epicenter of sort of slavery, the importation of slavery in the United States, but also it was the center of rice production. There was no real rice industry in America prior to folks from West Africa who had been farming rice for millennia, bringing over the ingenuity, the technology of how to do that, how to manage the tides, how to create these locks and dams that would flood and clear appropriately to raise this rice. And so that rice industry created America's first real generation of wealth. Of course, wealth came over from Europe, but American-grown wealth, rice was America's first real cash crop. And so for a 12-year-old, by the way, as mentioned, I have, 4 sons, and I often have thought, to send your child away to the big city, at the age of 12, I've got 2 kids in college now. I've got a senior in high school who's 18, who's bigger than I am. I have some trepidation about sending him to college, at 18, 19, to send your 12-year-old, but, those were the times. And I think the decision was that Robert was getting in trouble. Everyone sort of knew him as something of a troublemaker back in those times, and so it was best to send him away. Goes to Charleston, and throughout his whole time there, he was hired out for labor. So he would work, earn a salary, send that salary back to his master. So it became an income stream. One of the things that one of the skills that he developed was, some might call it the gift of gab, but just, his interaction, his speaking, his thinking, his reasoning, sorts of skills. And he had negotiated with his master to be able to have $1 of his paycheck. And with that dollar, Robert ended up working on the docks. And he would buy tobacco, fruit, various sundries, and he would resell them on the docks and make a bit of a profit. And I'll come back to that, but it just, again, I think it speaks to early on Robert's industriousness, his just having a vision that was perhaps a little broader than what his position in society as an enslaved young man, boy, would prescribe. So he, as I mentioned, he is attracted to the docks. He ends up working on a boat called the Planter that was, I think, 160-some foot side wheel steamer, one of the biggest boats in Charleston Harbor. Those of you who know Charleston is a peninsula with two rivers that meet in the harbor. The Cooper and the Ashley rivers come together, creating the harbor, and then out to the Atlantic. And Robert ultimately became a pilot on this boat, the Planter, and knew all of the ins and outs of the waterways along the whole Low Country, but particularly in Charleston. And so when the Civil War broke out, this boat, the Planter, was taken into service of the Confederate Army. And so curiously, here is this young man who, a little impetuous, a little aggressive, who clearly had freedom on his mind. He ends up in the employ working for the Confederate Army. And the boat became a transport boat. They had rigged it with some cannons and the like, but essentially it was big enough. It had a big platform that it would carry munitions and soldiers, and they would lay mines and all kinds of things. And fast forwarding now, he's in his young 20s, he's married, he has 2 young children, one of whom was my great-grandmother Elizabeth, another son Robert, and he was concerned. He not unlike any other human being, he loved his family, he loved his wife, he loved his children. But he knew that as an enslaved person, as the property of someone else, that like that, you can be sold apart from each other. And obviously that bothered him. And so he, again, started thinking much more seriously. He wanted to be free. He wanted to be free. And again, that's not unlike any and every enslaved person. But he had certain opportunities being on a boat that he would avail himself. The first thing he did, though, to endeavor to win his freedom, to earn his freedom, is he actually negotiated. I mentioned that he bought these sundries, was able to get $1 from each paycheck, go out and buy stuff, sell it on the docks, keep the profit, and then buy more. And he had negotiated with his wife's master to buy their freedom. And he actually put down, and again, he's earning $1 a week, let's say, and then buying other things and reselling it. But to give you a sense of his commitment and just how important this was, he negotiated a $500 payment for his wife and children and put down a $100 down payment. So again, every penny that he got and that he worked overtime to secure, he put toward this fund trying to buy the freedom of his family. Now, the interesting thing is, and of course his wife's master certainly never thought that he would get the $500 and gladly took the $100. Why wouldn't he, I guess, under that circumstance? But it's interesting because as an enslaved person, they didn't have the right to own property. And ultimately, that's what his family would have been sort of his property. So it would have gotten complicated, but he didn't stop there. He also, in thinking about freedom, he knew that there was a federal blockade outside the mouth of Charleston Harbor. And he knew that if he could figure out one way or another how to get there, he knew that he'd be free. And so, again, he's the pilot of this boat. So he's the person who sails the boat. He knows all the ins and outs of those sort of the areas. He knew, obviously, how to sail the boat. He had a crew that was on there with him. And so, to make a long story short, on the morning of May 13th, 1862, the Confederate crew left for the night, as they often did, went into town to carouse, to drink, to do whatever. And it was a dark night, as the story goes, and Robert got the other enslaved crew and their families, and he headed out to freedom. I always, I've often said, it's one thing to know how to sail under those conditions, and pitch black darkness. This was at 1, 2 in the morning at this point. And to take this boat and to skillfully sail it through the harbor. There were also 5 forts that he had to sail past. And with each fort, there was a passcode, a little ship's whistle he had to sort of execute. And by the way, he also put on the top hat, sort of the straw hat, and the long overcoat of the Confederate captain. And he would mimic sort of the walk, the gait. I don't know how he did, but he mimicked the gait of the Confederate captain. So at distance and in the darkness, the planter would be passing. He would blow the appropriate passcode. At distance, you would see the same straw hat and coat and perhaps the gait of the Confederate captain. And so at each time, it was past the planter. The last fort, however, was by far the most dangerous. Fort Sumter, right? That's where the Civil War began. The biggest fort with the most dangerous cannons. And it's said, those of you who've been to Charleston Harbor, you can see Fort Sumter, but it's a good little ways away. To sail out there, it'll take you probably 45 minutes. But the cannons were so powerful that they actually could bombard downtown Charleston, just to give you a sense of perspective. And so, I've often wondered just what Robert and his wife and children and the crew and their families, what must they have thought? They successfully passed 4 forts. There's the last one here. They're passing by Fort Sumter. And freedom is right there. You can see it. It's, I don't know, maybe a mile away or something on the water. And so it must have been this amazing mix of fear, because you are passing by the most dangerous fort. They could blow you out of the water with very little to no effort. But also, with this hope that they were close, that they were almost there. One of the things that, Robert, they all who agreed to go on this trip, they all knew that this was an extraordinarily dangerous endeavor, that it was life or death. And for them, literally, it was freedom or death. They lined the bottom of the boat with dynamite. They knew that if something went wrong and they got caught, they knew that not only would they just be killed, but they would be killed and tortured in a probably particularly public and violent way as an example to others who might have similar ideas. So that was not, they weren't going for that. So they lined the bottom of the boat. And again, it's a life or death proposition. And I often think, again, it's one thing to know how to sail under those conditions, but to do so under the prospect of imminent death. It's just amazing. And I honestly, I wouldn't be here had they not maneuvered through that. So I am thankful for their courage and skill in doing that. So they pass by Fort Sumter. They stay along the Confederate route as long as possible until they believe they're beyond the reach of the cannons on Fort Sumter. Then they quickly veer south. There was a Union blockade there. There was a Admiral Samuel S.F. DuPont from the DuPont family in Delaware. That was the head of the Union blockade down there. His responsibilities were broader than that, but he was also the head of the blockade. And so here comes this one of the biggest Confederate ships heading toward this Union blockade. And it's said that Robert had thought of so many of these details. He had thought of, just every single detail except for one. That here is this big boat with this huge Confederate flag in the middle of the night sailing unannounced toward a Union blockade. But luckily, thankfully, my great-great-grandmother Hannah had thought to sew together some bed sheets, white bed sheets, which they quickly lowered the Confederate flag, raised these bed sheets, the universal sort of sign of surrender, and they approached. The boat that they approached was the USS Onward. And, I've read some accounts that, the Union soldiers, again, at this point, it's probably, maybe it's starting to get light, so maybe 6 in the morning or something. And here's this huge boat with these, enslaved Africans on there, unannounced, whatever, and the whole thing sort of blew folks' minds. But they were free. They had made it. And it said that Robert, when he got off the boat, had some remarks. And something like, well, I thought, the planter here, old Uncle Abe, could, have some use for it. And as a matter of fact, there was enormous, extraordinary use for the boat. The boat in and of itself was valuable. Like I said, it was one of the largest in the harbor. But the day before, it had been filled with munitions and parrot cannons and the like. And so it was full of very rich material. And then I think even beyond that, Robert was the pilot of this boat. He knew all of the sort of Confederate intelligence around the Low Country. And of course he shared that. And up until that point in the war, the largest sort of raid or military exercise that the Union had was based upon information that Robert gave them, and it was successful. So that was really the first part of Robert's life, is that he grew up, worked on this boat, wanted to be free, yearned to be free. Sometimes people have asked me, well, what do you think he was thinking? What really drove him? And again, I think you can answer that at multiple levels. The answer about the fact that he wanted to preserve his family relationships, I think, was key. But then I also equate it to, freedom is there. You could see it, at a distance. And so it's almost like you take a starving person, someone who is starving, they haven't eaten in a week, and you put them in this room with this gorgeous, immaculate buffet, all the food and drink and just everything that you can imagine, and then you leave. What do you expect him to do? And I think to some degree, that was the opportunity that Robert took. And so I will, in the interest of time, I will speed the story up. But from there, Robert was received up and down the East Coast as a Civil War hero, one of the first real heroes of the Civil War. There were parades in Washington and Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. And he was kind of taken around, and it was sort of like the USO tour, that where it was a real morale booster, on the Union side. And and he got a reward for delivering the planner. There was a prescription for the percentage of the value of assets that you deliver to the U.S. government that you can win back as a reward. And he didn't get precisely that amount that Congress, sort of had prescribed. I guess they couldn't see giving, a formerly enslaved person, a black man, frankly, that kind of money. But I think he got $1,500, which again, in the day, was a good deal of money. And he could have stayed in the North and lived a very comfortable life as a Civil War hero, but instead he chose to, go back into the crucible of the war effort. He had dreamed of something for himself. He had won it for himself and for his family, but then that wasn't enough. He wanted to go back and he wanted to extend those rights to others, and he went back. To make a long story short, he fought in 18 battles, became the captain of the Planter, was the first African American to command a United States naval vessel, was the most senior African American to serve in the Civil War. There are all sorts of stories. The one story that really sort of characterized, it was the story about how he got to become the captain. They were in battle. The Planter was taking on heavy fire, and the Union captain at the time lost his nerve, and he left the area there, blanking on the name of it, but where you were sailing the ship, and went and hid under the deck. And Robert very quickly got up, and again, this is his boat. He had been pilot of it for years, and so he very quickly and safely maneuvered it to safety. And I think that effort was what got him named captain. But he came back and he fought, and ultimately there's an interesting story about him after the Civil War had ended, of coming back. The first time he had come back to Charleston, and Charleston at this point was decimated, by the war, and just I can imagine just what he felt like the first time he walked through the city streets of Charleston as a free person. But after the war, he went back to his hometown in Beaufort, again, as the car goes a couple hours south, and got involved. There was a lot that needed to be evolved in sort of recalibrating the system of government and the social systems during Reconstruction. Now, all of a sudden, African Americans were free and arguably on even footing for that brief period of Reconstruction with whites who had been their enslavers. And so he first got involved, as many people do, in joined the school board, or was elected to the school board, but then quickly was elected to the legislature, to the House and to the Senate. And one of the things that he did while in the legislature was he wrote the legislation to create the first free compulsory statewide public school system in South Carolina, and that was the first school system in America, public school system. There had been public schools, but they were sort of one-off, kinds of schools, largely for indigent, poor sorts of folks. And this school was created, or this system was created without regard to race, without regard to class. It was a public school system in the way that we conceive of public school systems today. And then he went on and was elected to Congress and served longer than any other African American during Reconstruction. And in part, that was because Beaufort was very much, there were, you all know the story about Reconstruction, that it began to unravel once the federal troops left the South. And there were all kinds of measures, legal measures, terrorist kinds of measures to intimidate people, but to sort of, for white folks to pull that power back. And Beaufort was an overwhelmingly African-American community, and so he was able to hold on to power. Perhaps that's why longer than anyone. But he went there and did a number of things in Congress. And so once Reconstruction ended, he came back and was appointed by the president to be the collector of customs, and lived out his life and died in 1915. So he had a nice long life. He had diabetes and passed. Although it's said that during one of these battles, during the Civil War, a shell burst near him and it damaged his eyes, and so phosphorus or something like that. And so, he was sort of ill and sort of infirm throughout much of his later life, but ended up serving until he was 1915. So that's a lot of setup. But that's the story I grew up with. And I grew up with Robert Smalls' grandchildren. My grandmother was Robert Smalls' granddaughter. She was born in 1897. He died in 1915. So the first 18 years of her life, she lived with him, largely in his house down in Beaufort. And so in different places of the country, he is known in different ways. Like some places, by the way, he became a major general in the state militia. And so some places he's known as General Smalls, other places he's known as Congressman Smalls. Well, we kind of grew up, he was grandpa. You know, he was a human being. And so I've heard all these rich and warm stories about him, about the humanity of him, that was very powerful. And so, you know, as I mentioned, I grew up 60s, 70s, was in Boston. Getting into the 70s, forced busing was a big deal. And so, you know, it was just a very tense time around race. And it seemed like, as a youngster, that it wasn't every day, but it was certainly every week I was somehow confronted about who I was, about my race, about, you know, my identity or something. And for me, knowing that I was connected to Robert Smalls made all the difference in the world. Now, I will also say I grew up, both my parents have their PhDs, both my grandparents had their PhDs. You know, Robert's son-in-law, my great-grandfather, was a lawyer and business person and everything. So I grew up with an accomplished kind of a family, but the story of Robert Smalls really helped to give me, you know, some measure of backbone to help me push through. I remember tangibly thinking, you know, well, how does what I'm going through now compare with what Robert Smalls dealt with? And how would he have dealt with this challenge? And it always kind of gave me a little oomph to move forward. And so it's been important. I remember growing up, I love books to this day, and I would spend a lot of times in bookstores, and I would always, the first place I'd go, you know, I'd go to the African American Studies section of the book to see if there was anything new about Robert Smalls. And growing up, there was very, very little. You know, there were some encyclopedias, and they included some small things about him, but it's only really been in the last 15 or 20 years, I think, that Robert Smalls has really become much more of a popular figure. But, you know, for most African Americans, you know, family history has been a very challenging endeavor. You know, most of us maybe can go back a couple of generations. Maybe we know about the name of a great-grandparent, but it's very, very difficult. And either way, going back, you know, tracing our lineage back is pretty much always, there's been a wall, which has been, they call it the brick wall of 1870, which is prior to 1870, the names of enslaved ancestors were not written in the United States Census. So it's just almost impossible to sort of go back there. And then even beyond that, it's been, again, almost impossible to trace our lineage back to Africa. DNA testing recently has helped. But I say all that to say is that for people to trace their lineage back to a period where their ancestors were owned by other people, were considered chattel, it's been a tough anchor to sort of the African American experience. And so for me, I just have felt so, it's been a blessing to be able to know a little bit more about my history in the way that I have. And so that brings me to this broader conversation about history. And I mentioned the quote. Anyone know where that quote comes from? The farther you can look back, the farther ahead you can see. Does that ring a bell to anybody? That's Winston Churchill. Yeah. And you know, Abe Lincoln said something similar. It's like you got to know where you came from to know what to do next. And history, it matters. It's not just an interesting, you know, course that you take in school. It's not just a hobby that people can have. It has a real influence. Narratives are created, national narratives sometimes, that define how people perceive, how they think, how they behave. And those narratives typically are driven by history. And so it matters. And for me, I've had this balanced kind of or contradictory kind of relationship with history. On the one hand, I've been very excited by my connection, my personal connection to history, but I've also been perplexed and confused by some aspects of history. For example, I remember really distinctly, I was in middle school, and, I was in elementary school, and you hear the words, Christopher Columbus discovered America. And I remember thinking, how does someone discover something where millions of people have been there for tens of thousands of years? Like, I just couldn't piece that together. And then in middle school, I remember reading about the words of our founding fathers. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator, our Creator, with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But yet, of course, I knew that that didn't apply to my ancestors, who were enslaved at the time. And then, as I got older, I realized that didn't apply to women. And as a matter of fact, that didn't apply to most white men. It was only white men of privilege and property. And so, I just wrestled with history. And at the time, I came up with sort of the cynical perspective, what I thought was cynical, but over time, I've come to realize that maybe it was truer. But I came to realize that history is less of a literal articulation of events. It's not just this happened, then that happened, then that happened. History is told through, it has no choice but to be told through the lens of the people telling the stories. It is as much a tool of sort of social construction. It's a vehicle to, for people to create stories that they want their grandchildren to know about them than anything else. And if you are a part of the group telling the story, obviously the story is going to be told to your benefit, and it's going to prop you up. There's an old African adage that says that until the lion gets its own historian, the history of the hunt will always favor the hunter. and to me, that quote sort of captured the role that power plays in history. Right? It's who's telling the story. One of my favorite quotes is from Henry Ford. Whether you think you can or not, you're right. Whether you think you can or not, you're right. And I think that speaks to the psychology of achievement, the fact that you've got to be able to see yourself doing certain things, to be able to do and be certain things. And if history is telling you, if the narrative that is driven by history is saying certain things about you, then often it can be really, really difficult to break out of that. For example, there's been an old sort of narrative that has said that women are not good in hard sciences and math. And we all know that that's ridiculous. But the impact of that is that there are less women in hard sciences and math than there should be. I mean, there are all kinds of things. I think about, for African Americans, the narrative for this country to have done the things, the inhumane things that it did to enslave people, it had to create a narrative to allow them to do those things. And that narrative dehumanized this whole group of people. It described them as animals, as beasts of burden, violent, aggressive, dangerous. And it's why in 2019, not to get political, I don't intend for this to be political, but it's why, there is this issue, in my view, with police violence. There is this narrative that African Americans are dangerous and violent and whatever. And I think the reason why that narrative still exists is because, for the most part, we've never dealt with the history that created that narrative. We've never, in South Africa, for example, they had this Truth and Reconciliation process, commission process. You can argue about how successful it was, but they made the effort to put people on both sides of history together and to try to reconcile, their positions and where they were. We've never done that, and so this narrative exists. And so, as an African American, you can be a young boy playing on a playground, or you can be minding your business, eating ice cream in your apartment, or you can be babysitting your nephew, but you are still believed to be such a mortal threat that your life can be taken from you in an instant. But yet mass murderers are taken to Burger King. many of you may know the story. In my neck of the woods in Charleston, Dylan Roof came into Mother Emanuel Church, which is located about as far away from our office as that door is, right across the street. Killed 9 people, but yet when he was apprehended, he said he was hungry and they took him to Burger King. So I just say all that to say that history matters, that it drives how we think about each other. It drives, so much, and it's important. And frankly, it's why museums like this are so important, because they provide these platforms to talk about history and to talk about all angles of the history. And so it's wonderful. So let me just get a quick drink here. So, being respectful of your time, because I can go on forever. But so how did I get into the museum business? I'm a business guy, as mentioned. I've run marketing companies, and I'm a brand guy, marketing guy. But because of my connection to Robert Smalls, I was involved in the year 2012. There were sesquicentennial commemorations of Civil War events in Charleston. And again, for those of you who are somewhat familiar with Charleston, Charleston is a living museum. It's like everywhere you turn, something happened there. And so back in 2012, 150 years beyond the Civil War, there's all these commemorations. One of them was about Robert Smalls, commemorating the May 13th, 1862 date. And so our family came and gave a lot of talks, and I met the mayor at the time, the mayor of Charleston. His name was Joe Riley. Mayor Riley was one of the longest serving mayors in history. He served 40 years in Charleston. And so he invited me back and to a number of different events to speak, and then he invited me to join the board of the International African American Museum, knowing of my connection to Robert Smalls, knowing of my passion for history, and I guess of my business sort of background. And so I joined the board, and we were moving along. At the time, I was running a food company, and sold the food company, and then Mayor Riley said, Michael, I've been working on this project. He announced his vision for the International African American Museum in his State of the City address in the year 2000. And so this is now probably 2015. He says, Michael, I've been working on this thing for 15 years. I've been in office for 40 years. I'm about to retire. We got to get this thing done, and I need you to help me get it across the finish line. And Mayor Riley can be a very, being in office for 40 years, you learn lots of skills, and the power of persuasion is one of them. And so I joined the effort full time as president and CEO, and thinking that it was going to be maybe a year and a half to raise the money to do the work. And so I commuted. I was at the time living in the suburb of Atlanta, and so I would leave Monday morning, come back Friday night. And at the year and a half point, knowing how much more work we had to do, I grabbed my family, and we ended up moving back. And so that was probably, about 5 years ago or so. But we raised the money. We raised, as Wayne mentioned, all in all about $125 million. The way the project was conceived, the city bought the land for $25 million, and it's right on the Cooper River. It's just south of the aquarium, if any of you know that. But right on the Cooper River. Beautiful, beautiful site. $25 million. And then the idea was to raise $12.5 million each from the city and from the county for another $25 million bucket. To raise $25 million from the state of South Carolina, and then to raise $25 million from private philanthropy. And so my effort primarily was involved in raising that $25 million. And it's interesting, last August, we had finally raised that amount of money. And we had this big celebration. And then because we're connected to the city of Charleston, we had to raise all the money before we could begin construction. So we raised all the money. They allow us to begin construction. The first phase of that is to price everything out. Now, we had priced stuff, at least once or twice a year, but this was the first time we were pricing it for real. And you won't be surprised that because of steel tariffs and inflation and everything else, we found out that we were about another $25 million short. So the analogy is, we were working all this time, and it's like the first time, you train so hard to run a marathon. You finally, marathon day is here, you run, you complete it, you're just so happy, and someone comes up, excuse me, Mr. Moore, you've got another 5 miles to go. That was the feel of it. But we, finally were able to raise that money from individuals, from corporations, from foundations. And it was, that project was very much to its advantage. It had the fact that Mayor Riley was behind it. He was just a wonderful resource. I only think there was one person that I'm aware of that we called who wouldn't kind of take our call, and that was, blanking on the guy's name, but the guy, Rubenstein, David Rubenstein, who is a huge benefactor of the Smithsonian's. I think he funded the big renovations of the Washington Monument. And he was just like, look, I put in $100 million into the Smithsonian's, I'm tapped out. But that was an enormous advantage. The building itself, a couple things interesting about it. It's going to be raised off the ground about 15 feet, in part because we're in the low country and FEMA has something to say about that. But more importantly, from a sort of a thematic sort of idea, we will have hundreds and hundreds of artifacts, but by far the single most valuable artifact will be the ground itself. It was the former Gadsden's Wharf. It was the largest wharf in the colonies. And again, as mentioned, it's the spot where almost half of all the enslaved Africans who came to this country, where they took their first steps. It's said that all living African Americans today have at least one relative among those who landed there. So very powerful space, very important space. So lifting the ground allows us to sort of interpret and to sort of treat the grounds in a very appropriate sort of a way. It's about 40,000 square feet, one floor of a sort of museum space. There'll be a little mezzanine on the top that for office space. A number of things that are special about it. In terms of the grounds, we did some archaeology work and found the original wharf line. They filled in over the generations. And so there's more ground there than there was historically. We found the original wharf line, and so we putting a big steel band along that wharf line, inscribing some history on it. And the band will actually go underneath the building, and the way it's built, the light will shine and reflect off of it, and you'll be able to see it reflecting off the underside of the building. I think that will be powerful. We're also I went to Sierra Leone. We there's a strong relationship, quickly I'll tell you, between Sierra Leone and South Carolina. The first connection is after the Revolutionary War, I think 1789, 87, a group of formerly enslaved Africans were taken by the British up to Nova Scotia to be free. And as you might imagine, these Africans didn't find Nova Scotia to be quite their liking from a weather standpoint. And so they ended up being taken back to Sierra Leone. And those people founded what is now Freetown. Freetown is the current capital of Sierra Leone. And so it's an interesting juxtaposition that Freetown is founded by former Charlestonians who left and went down. There are a number of other connections. The oldest university in sub-Saharan Africa is a university called Flora Bay College. And its first president was an African-American Charlestonian, one of the first African-Americans to earn a college degree, left America, went to Sierra Leone to head this institution. I mentioned the rice industry and how important that was. A lot of that ingenuity came from West Africa, but a lot of it from Sierra Leone, where they had for millennia been producing rice. The other thing that was really powerful, there were so many times when I would stand on the docks sort of our space, a former Gadsden's Wharf, and I'd look out over the water. You can look and you can see Fort Sumter, and then you can see the horizon just beyond. And I would dream about what was on the other side of that horizon, because Africa literally was right sort of there, a few thousand miles away, and I would dream about that. And then I had this opportunity to go to Sierra Leone, and I stood on the spot where it said that there's an old slave fort called Bunce Island. Bunce Island was a British fort where they used to aggregate captives before putting them on slave ships and sending them. They say that 90% of all the captives who left Bunce Island came to Charleston. So again, there's this connection. And so for me, to have a chance to stand on the dock, on the stone jetty, where my ancestors took their last steps on the African continent a couple hundred years ago plus. I mean, it was just a powerful experience. And so I say all that to say, those stones on this jetty where they would march people down, we're actually taking a couple of those stones, a few of the stones, bringing them to Charleston, where so many of them arrived, and creating a memorial to those ancestors, which I think would be so powerful. And the idea is to create it in a way that people can reach out and touch it, and thereby potentially touch something that their ancestor last touched a couple hundred years ago. Powerful experience. There's a lot of things special. Last thing I'll just mention, I talked about genealogy. The museum is creating a center for family history. There are lots and lots of obstacles to African American family search. I touched on a few of them, the brick wall of 1870 among them. But we've already amassed the databases and the human resources to make that Center for Family History the most powerful sort of resource for African American family search in the country. And so that would be a powerful place where you can go, like most African Americans, and not know a whole lot, maybe a few generations, and walk away. And it's going to take more than one time, but figuratively walk away with your family tree sort of filled out in this country, and then with DNA testing, being able to know from where your people come from. And so I think that'll be a powerful thing. So, I've tried to prosecute the case that history matters. With this museum, we're trying to create a space that tells stories, that elevates history, that has been for too long undertold. This country has been extraordinarily enhanced economically, culturally, socially, by all of the Americans who came, except for our native brothers and sisters. We all came from someplace. But African American history broadly has been somewhat muted. And so we're just proud of the opportunity to tell these stories and to create a space that will be inspiring, will be uplifting, particularly for young people, to have them walk along a building and see stories, read history of people who did amazing things, but who also look like them, and hopefully inspire them and give them a sense of the greatness that might lie inside them. So I have talked too long.
Oh no. Oh no.
But I would love to, if there are any questions or anything, I would love to, please, sir.